Welcome back, everybody. This is our last session before the final session. This is session number 6, titled Islamophobia and Human Rights, the Impact of Demonization and Exclusion. And we're going to have some excellent speakers among us this afternoon. It's a 2-hour session, so we're looking forward to it. Our moderator for the day is Linda Hyokki, who is a senior research associate here at CIGA. Linda graduated in 2011 from a master's program, Language, Culture, and Translation from the University of Mainz in Germersheim, Germany. As I said, she's currently a senior research associate at the Center for Islamic Global Affairs at this university, where her focus of research is in Islamophobia and Muslim minorities, which is one of our departments. She's also pursuing her PhD at Ibn Khaldun University with a thesis on Finnish Muslim converts, experiences of Islamophobia. As a fellow at the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies in the UK, she teaches in workshops on future studies for the Muslim youth. Linda's research interests include Islamophobia studies, conversion to Islam, identity formation, critical theory, quantitative research, and alternative epistemologies. Please welcome with me Linda Hyokki.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sami, for the introductions. A warm welcome also from me to this session. What we're going to do today is that we have 4 distinguished speakers with us. However, the first one is through FaceTime, so we're going to connect her from this laptop to the screen. Our first speaker today is Dr. Tamara Sonn, and she's the Hamad bin Khalifa Thani Professor in the History of Islam at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University in the US. Tamara Sonn's most recent books include Islam and Democracy After the Arab Spring, Islam, History, Religion and Politics, and Is Islam an Enemy of the West? She has lectured in North America, Europe, the Middle East, South Asia and Africa, and she is also the founding editor-in-chief of Oxford Bibliographies Online, Islamic Studies, and the senior editor of Oxford Islamic Studies Online and Oxford Encyclopedia, The Islamic World. Now, okay, so Dr. Sami wants to say a few words about the Dr. Tamara Sonn as well, and then we're going to proceed to connect her. Thank you.
Well, I've known Tamara for a long time. She's a very good friend, but she's also a great scholar, and we're very honored and privileged to have her with us. She was supposed to be with us in person, but for some reasons and emergencies, she couldn't. So we're very pleased that she's joining us from Washington, D.C. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, so you can tell that somebody's lecturing at 5 o'clock in the morning, so that's great. It's really great for us to have her with us, and we thank her for being with us. And she will talk to us today about topics that are related to Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So you can proceed, Tamara.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Linda, and thank you so much, Dr. Arya. And thanks to all of those of you who have worked to bring this important event together. Today, I'd like to dedicate my comments to our esteemed departed colleague, mentor, and friend, Dr. Mumtaz Ahmed. Though he left us 3 long years ago, he's still very much with us, inspiring us with his stellar record of intellectual integrity and moral courage. As president of International Islamic University in Islamabad, and director of the Iqbal International Institute for Research and Dialogue, Dr. Mumtaz maintained profound commitment to academic freedom, critical thinking, human rights, rule of law, pluralism, democracy, and overall, his overarching Islamic value, his embrace of the Islamic value of human dignity. As Dr. John Esposito of Georgetown University put it, Mumtaz Ahmed will be remembered for his gentle but firm willingness to speak truth to power. That commitment and those values form the context of my comments today on the similarities and differences between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and their implications. So, Islamophobia, literally, extreme fear often accompanied by hatred directed towards Islam. Anti-Semitism, literally, opposition to speakers of Semitic languages, but we all know it really means Judeophobia, which was the term that was used before the term anti-Semitism was coined in the 19th century. So right away we see a difference. Islamophobes' fear-induced hatred is focused on Islam, the religion. So we see in signs of that in campaigns against building mosques or publishing the Quran, anti-Sharia legislation, laws that ban symbols of Islam. Some Islamophobes deny that Islam is even a religion. They say it's a political ideology, an ideology that motivates evil deeds. And like Nazism and communism, they say it must be extinguished. But more commonly, Islamophobes portray Islam as a violent, hate-filled religion. You're all familiar with examples. Anti-Semitism, by contrast, is hatred of Jews, the people, not Judaism, the religion. No one needs reminding of Russian pogroms or the Holocaust or any of the other massacres of Jews. But there are important similarities as well. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism both manifest themselves in hate crimes. Crimes that target individuals based on nothing other than their perceived identity as Jews or Muslims, which statistics show are at an all-time high. Hate crimes and groups targeting Muslims are included in these statistics, but Muslims aren't the sole or even the main focus of hatred. In the US, data released by the FBI show that the majority of hate crime victims are targeted for race or ethnicity, but those targeting people for religious identity are increasing. Among those victims, Jews are by far the most numerous, more than twice the number of reported hate crimes against Muslims. But as you know, the proportion of Muslim victims is increasing. So though anti-Semitism is really Judeophobia, fear and hatred of Jews, while Islamophobia is really hatred of Islam, the two come together in victimization of random individuals based on identity, because you can't shoot a religion or an ideology. You can only kill people. And both reflect the misperception that all those who share a particular religious identity share as well a set of negative characteristics. So that if individual Muslims commit evil deeds, then all Muslims must be evil. No Muslims can be trusted. If individual Jews commit evil deeds, then all Jews must be evil. No Jews can be trusted. When we look at how these generalized fears of entire groups are framed, we see more differences. American writer Robert Spencer claims in his 2003 book, Inside Islam, A Guide for Catholics, that Islam constitutes a threat to the world at large. Spencer frames his arguments in highly questionable religious terms. Anders Breivik, the Norwegian convicted of killing 77 advocates of diversity in 2011, cites Spencer 64 times, but he puts a different spin on that claim. He says that Euro-Christians are being replaced by immigrants, especially Muslims. The Great Replacement, in fact, is the name of the 2019 New Zealand Killers Manifesto, a title he borrowed from the right-wing French writer Renaud Camus. In a 2012 book with that title, Camus spreads fear that immigrants in general, including Muslims, are in the process of driving Euro-Christians into extinction. Another phrase used by people who share that fear is white genocide. This is a fear propagated as early, very evidently by European colonial settlers in the 19th century. They enacted legislation to prohibit mixing of the races, weaponizing the discredited pseudoscience of distinct races among human beings. They used this as a strategy to keep their so-called white race from being diluted. That is, in reality, they used it as a strategy to maintain power in their own group's hands. So this kind of fear then turns into all-purpose hatred, like that demonstrated in the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where gangs chanted white supremacist slogans like, "You will not replace us," but also anti-Semitic slogans, "The Jews will not replace us," and then, "White Sharia now." They chanted that. What can that even mean? It's a bizarre combination of Islamophobic perceptions of the status of Muslim women and white supremacist contempt for women. They want to put women in their place, behind closed doors, procreating at a rapid rate. That's what women are for. And they, in their Islamophobic perception, think that's what Muslims do. That toxic mix of ignorance, fear, hatred exploded into violence, resulting in the murder of random victim Heather Heyer, who was at the demonstration to protest hatred in all its forms. But we also have more exclusive hatred, like the killer of 6 Muslim worshippers in Quebec City in 2017, and the New Zealand shooter, who specifically targeted Muslims. The Quebec City killer claimed that he thought Muslim refugees in his neighborhood were a threat to his family in particular. The New Zealander was sure that Muslims were a threat to all Euro-Christians. His manifesto is a call to action against Muslims everywhere. Judeophobia has a different etiology. It goes all the way back to the 4th century, when Christianity became politicized in the Roman Empire under Constantine. Then, anyone who didn't identify with Christianity was considered a potential traitor. But Judeophobia evolved into a pathology much more insidious than its political form. It was rationalized by pseudo-religious claims that all Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, and preposterous claims that Jews consume Christian blood, and more generic claims that Jews were morally deficient, inherently sneaky and greedy. Where did that come from? Like Muslims, medieval Christians were not allowed to engage in interest-bearing finance. Jews weren't either, among other Jews. But since Christian laws excluded them from most mainstream economic venues, they turned to jobs that Christians rejected, including money lending. Of course, those who are driven to borrow money are often in difficult circumstances in the first place, so they resent those who seem to have all the money, enough money to lend. The truly impoverished had no chance of lashing out at those who were the real source of their poverty. So throughout history, they turned on the only people potentially weaker than they were, the marginalized groups, women, Roma, and always Jews. And in all cases, they fabricated stories to justify their hatred. Witchcraft, that was women and Roma. Greed, dishonesty, and treachery for Jews. They spun grand narratives to illustrate Jewish treachery, and these stories, very entertaining to some, circulated very widely. You're no doubt familiar with the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example, a fictional account of a secret meeting of Jewish conspirators concocted in Russia to justify their deadly scapegoating pogroms in the early 1900s. The protocols patched together conspiracy theories, conspiracy stories circulating since the late 1700s when Poland was dismantled and its Jewish communities were incorporated into Russia and Austria. The protocols claimed that there's a secret international organization of Jews, all very well organized, gradually taking over all the world's financial institutions and plotting ultimately to control the whole entire world. Pure fiction, of course, but convincing enough for Christians who felt weak and threatened and didn't understand why they were so disadvantaged or what to do about it. Conspiracy theories are always the refuge of the ignorant. But unfortunately, these Euro-Christian conspiracy theories remain alive and well, not just in Christian societies. They've metastasized outside their original Christian hosts. They've developed in Muslim societies as well. For example, in the claim that Jews were responsible for the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. I don't know if you've heard that one, but it does circulate. Jews wanted to rule the world, you see, starting with Palestine, so they needed to overthrow the Ottoman overlords of Palestine. So they created the Committee of Union and Progress. That would ultimately undermine the role of Islam and impose a secular government so Jews could take over and push Turkey into the European Union, which Jews also control, along with the United Nations, and they control that too through their stranglehold on the world's financial institutions. There are several twists to this plot. One version, you're probably familiar with, traces the Jews' plot to take over the world all the way back to the 17th century in Salonika, when Rabbi Sabbatai Zvi claimed he embraced Islam, but he was really just pretending, so that he could infiltrate Muslim society. And that's how Jews managed to create this Committee of Union and Progress in the first place and then dismantle the Ottoman Empire. I'm not making this up. As you may be aware, there are still allegations that political enemies are secretly Jews trying to take over the world. The Jews and crypto-Jews get thrown in together with random other groups, Masons, communists, sometimes even Baha'is. But Jews are the perennial favorite enemy, not just some Jews, but all Jews. Because again, the similarities, like Islamophobes, who fear and hate all Muslims because of what some Muslims have done. Anti-Semites fear and hate all Jews because of what they claim some Jews have done. I want to close with some observations about the way forward. When we hear these hatreds coming from rural folk with little education, it simply reflects ignorance, the failure of the larger society to provide proper guidance. But when we hear hatred emanating from those in power, then we know we're in the presence of demagogues, manipulating ignorance and fear for political gain. We've seen the results of that kind of politicized Islamophobia in the US, Canada, Europe, and most recently New Zealand. But here's the reason I think it's important to address Islamophobia and anti-Semitism together. Those of us who try to bring public awareness to Islamophobia and political manipulation of people's fears, those of us who try to do that and counter stereotypes of danger and violence outside of gatherings like this, where we're pretty much preaching to the choir, when we venture out and speak to the populations most in need of the information, we inevitably encounter people who are acutely aware of anti-Semitism among Muslims. Not just political grievances against specific Israeli policies, but full-blown Judeophobia. They can cite popular tracts of specific ideologues and specific acts of violence against random Jewish targets. These are, of course, deviations from the ideals and norms of Islam. Hatred of Jews, like hatred of Muslims, represents no ideals, no core religious values. But those hatreds do represent socio-political realities of frightened and often beleaguered people who can be driven to violence. These realities must be acknowledged and addressed in practical terms. Together, Jews, Christians, and Muslims must all work to counter the hatred and polarization that's pulling the world apart. We can take inspiration from Dr. Mumtaz Ahmed, who universalized the value of human dignity. He believed that the global community must work together against all forms of bigotry and hatred. Our lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren depend on it, and no one knew that better than Dr. Mumtaz Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tamara. This was a very nice start for our panel. I'm trying to just move myself a little so that you can also see me. All right, we are going to, those volunteers in the hall, please be ready with your microphones because we're going to get the questions for Dr. Tamara right now. But first I'm going to ask you a question, if I may. Since I am myself very much into studying convert Muslims, I would like to ask your opinion about something that you actually mentioned in the beginning. You were commenting on anti-Semitism being hatred against Jews and Islamophobia being hatred against Islam. Now, I'm just wondering if we're thinking about convert Muslims, and if you read the manifest of this of the shooter in Christchurch, he actually explicitly mentioned that those Muslims that he hates the most are the converts. Now, I would like to ask your opinion about this. How would you analyze, are we dealing here with hatred against Islam or hatred against Muslims as individuals? Because I haven't, for example, ever heard something similar related to Judaism. Like, people don't really propagate hatred against convert Jews. So what would be your comment on this? Thank you.
You mean you think people don't feel hatred for people, Jews who convert to some other tradition? Or
no, actually, non-Jewish individuals converting to Judaism. Because the shooter of Christchurch, he actually said in his manifesto that he explicitly hates convert Muslims because he sees them as traitors of their heritage and of their culture. So if you would just like to comment on this a little bit, I mean, drawing on some, similarities or differences between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as you see it.
Well, in the case of identitarian politics, which is what the most recent horrific atrocities against Muslims are motivated by, but they're also, identitarianism is also responsible for atrocities against Jews and Africans and African Americans, African Canadians, gender differences. So it's and so yes, it is the conflation of religious identity and political loyalties in their perception, and identitarian scholars, scholars, I shouldn't say that, but identitarian individuals in their minds. So, of course, any deviation from Euro-Christian identity would be interpreted as treason. But I think at a different level, in a completely different context, you may well be aware that in the monotheisms, monotheisms are the traditions that have conversions or shifts in religious identity or primary religious identity. We don't find it in the non-monotheisms. There are always anecdotal situations. I don't say it's a pattern, but anecdotal situations of certain level of mistrust, if nothing else. I've heard people in all traditions say, just privately and behind closed doors, well, he's a convert. She's a convert. What do they know? Outside, in public, there tends to be a kind of competition. Somebody converted into our team. Look, the conversions are escalating. I was involved in a conversation with an eminent scholar of Judaism in Tampa, Florida, many years ago. Some people in the room may be familiar with this individual, who was talking about just this phenomenon and said, we don't consider it a race. Who can have the most number of converts? And he acknowledged as well that behind closed doors, there is this certain suspicion. Somebody is, they're a convert. They weren't born into us. So there are those kinds of suspicions, but I think those are two very, very different things. When religious identity is the same as political identity, and one shifts one's religious identity, then it's interpreted as a shift in political identity, which is why the monotheisms from the earliest days, including Islam, prohibited so-called conversion into another tradition. Because if you left your tradition, your religious identity, it was interpreted as joining an alternative identity which was considered, at least potentially, a political threat. So, as always, there's a political etiology to this particular pathology. You're welcome.
Now, do we have questions from the audience, please? Over here.
Assalamu alaikum, Professor Tamara Sonn. Do you recognize the voice?
I do indeed.
Thank you so much for the kind words you said about my father, and it's good to see you, and it's good to hear you. There are others here as well that obviously knew my father, and I think very much appreciate the words that you had said. I also wanted to just reiterate what Dr. Sami Al-Arian was saying about the incredible, heroic role that Professor Tamara Sonn has played in the United States. It's not been an easy time over the past 2 decades. Just one or two stories will kind of give you a sense. After so I was at the College of William and Mary, where Professor Tamara Sonn was teaching, and after 9/11, when Professor Tamara Sonn was doing her best in trying to give some context of what the heck is going on in the world, we had local right-wing radio stations calling her Taliban Tammy. it was really bad, and we felt really bad. But Professor Tamara Sonn was like a motherly figure for the Muslim Students Association at the College of William and Mary. That's how she was for us there, and I can't say enough about the role that she played. Another funny story that came to mind that I think that she had reminded me of, both her and my father were at a conference on Muslim minorities, and Professor Tamara Sonn had praised how the intellectual discourse in South African Muslim communities was quite advanced. And my father, being very South Asian, Pakistan-centric, said, well, who cares for South Africa, and really didn't know much about it. But later on, then we introduced him to a few of our friends from South Africa, and later on he said, Tamara, I think you were right, that there's some stuff going on elsewhere in the world as well. But my question, Professor Tamara Sonn, is that we hear about somewhat of a shift, and I think back to, let's not even talk about how long ago this was, but 10, 15 years ago when we were at William and Mary, how it was very difficult to have, say, the Muslim Student Association and Hillel do joint activities. I remember once the Hillel, the Jewish students, they had invited Robert Spencer or someone like that to speak on Islam, and we asked them, why would you do that? And they said, well, we wanted to learn about Islam. And I remember my answer was something like, well, if I want to learn about Judaism, will I invite Hitler or something? Really, for God's sake. But I'm wondering if you perceive things to have improved on these issues, because I have a sense that at least in the United Kingdom, also in the US, there are now kind of movements, and within the Jewish community itself, a lot of questioning taking place about sort of the very right-wing Likud, Netanyahu type policies. So I just wanted to get your take on that, and it's again lovely to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Junaid. It is so nice to at least hear you. I wish I were there to see everyone. And inshallah someday I will be there physically again. And the funny stories, well, they weren't funny at the time. But one does still get attacked regularly, actually. Most recently, I was described in one of the Jihad Watch sites. Somebody had heard a talk about pluralism in Islam and the etiology of terrorism. And he said that Tamara Sonn is maybe well-intentioned, but she's what we call a useful idiot. And I thought, that's an improvement. At least I'm useful to someone. But it does go on. There are serious concerns and fears in all communities. But with regard to student groups and atmospheres on campuses, in my experience, it changes from cohort to cohort. That is, 1 year or 1, 2, 3 year period when you've got a handful of brilliant, wonderful students, such as we had at William and Mary, there was enough strong effort and courage among the students to band together, to support one another, to give them enough courage to reach out to other groups. And the same with Jewish student organizations. Sometimes maybe there'll be a group who are too afraid or too distrustful or too familiar with stories of anti-Semitism among Muslims to reach out, to trust us. But other times there'll be enough people who are able to mutually support and give courage to one another to reach out, even if it may not necessarily yield results. These kinds of efforts take courage, they take faith, they take commitment to one's values, even if one feels totally threatened. Again, going back to your father, the discussions we had about the importance of making oneself vulnerable. When we gather together as people of like mind, it's very therapeutic, in fact, I would say. We all know that we basically are on the same page, intellectually, morally, and sometimes even politically. And so together we can complain about everybody else and not necessarily self-scrutinize. But when we venture into other people's turf, then one becomes vulnerable. We do have situations in which we've had to have police escort because of threats. That's not a comfortable situation to be in. But unless we move out of our comfort zones, we will make no progress. We will continue to fall victim to very, to me, obvious strategies, political strategies of demagogues whose plan it is to weaken society by polarizing it. In the situation we have in the world today, the one you've been discussing and we were just talking about, where people are afraid of each other because people are concerned about hatreds and treason, political concerns, and that fear turns to hatred, then we get the polarization and the pretty regular eruptions of violence that keep us as a community politically weakened. We're unable to come together to establish collective governance, the kind that all of us claim our values represent. So I think that from community to community, from cohort to cohort, from campus to campus, there isn't a single pattern, but a few people with the moral courage and intellectual integrity to reach out to those very people who are afraid of us can make all the difference in the world. And your father, Junaid, Dr. Mumtaz Ahmed, was a perfect example of that, my hero and role model.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tamara, for your contribution today, and we really appreciate the fact that you actually woke up so early in order to participate in this session. Let's give a round of applause for Dr. Tamara. Now I'm going to close this FaceTime and wish you a restful sleep.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. I don't know what to do with this. Okay. Thank you. Yes, me and technology don't go together very well. All right, now we're going to continue with our other esteemed speakers. The second speaker of our panel is Mr. Elsadig Elsheikh. He's the director of the Global Justice Program at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to Haas Institute, Mr. Elsadig led the international program at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at the Ohio State University, where he also served as an associate editor of the Institute's journal Race, Ethnicity, Multidisciplinary in Global Contexts. Earlier, he was a researcher with the European Economic Community, also Amnesty International, Witness for Peace, and various other international grassroots and advocacy organizations. His research focuses on the socio-political dynamics of neoliberal globalization as related to citizenship, food systems, global migration, state and human rights, and structural racialization. Now, Mr. Elsadig is going to give us a speech titled Consequences of Islamophobia on Civil Liberties and Rights in the United States. And in this speech, he will address how the US federal government and state legislatures, as well as politicians and grassroots organizing efforts, subjugate Muslims to unwarranted surveillance, profiling, exclusion, and discrimination along the lines of racial and ethnic identity as determined by their national origin and religion. The floor is yours, Mr. Elsadig.
Thank you so much, Linda. How is that? Good? Okay. First of all, I really would like to thank Dr. Shami and all CIGA team for their tremendous hospitality and for making us so comfortable, but also for providing the space to have this wonderful conference and to bring these different voices from around the globe to discuss matters that is close to our interests. My presentation will be focusing on the work that we've been carrying at the Haas Institute to not only critiquing the phenomena that most of us might agree, but also to think through the lens of public policy what the possibility is for intervention, how we do that. For me, as an activist scholar, always I thought about inside-outside strategy. If I don't like that thing, what I will do about it. So for me, coming from the human rights framework, as a child of the global south, always the narrative does not include my concern, but yet I've been subjugated to it. So I decided to use it in order to reclaim my own space. So the goal and focus of this work was based on large study and large body of work. One of them, this report came out 2 years ago. We've been able to build a first database that scrutinizes the whole entire infrastructure of Islamophobia in legislation in the United States, so in 50 states. This way, I guess. But also, in order to do that, I just have to situate the context a little bit. Islamophobia did not emerge after 9/11 or because of the reaction to 9/11. It's always been part of the American polity, but in order for us to understand that, sorry, the footnote, I just have to apologize that it's extremely American-centric, the presentation, since that's my field of work. So Islamophobia, as a part of the larger framework of racism that carried by Eurocentrism, whether in Europe or by extension in the United States and other places, it is always been part of the larger framework of structural racism. And I find it sometimes difficult for me to explain because many Muslims in my community, that's not in their back of their mind when they think about Islamophobia. So Islamophobia for me it comes after many structures that are always intended to marginalize the other being non-white, non-European. So before us were the genocide of the indigenous people of the United States, after them the slave trade, the Chinese Exclusionary Act, the Japanese internment camp, the criminalization of undocumented folks, and here we go, us, and also the trans, LGBTQ community, and above all, also the natural world, how we discriminate from Eurocentric point of view. And this kind of structural racialization, because is a process, it is not an end subject. Also that generate unsettling feeling for the dominant group, particularly in the US, the white European, that the fear and anxiety of a tremendous changing of demographic shifts, and also just an anxiety about our visibility. You know, the more visible we are, the more the fear and anxiety increases within them. So this is kind of the context of it. But there are other two pieces that I would like to bring into it. One of them is the excessive militarization of American society and Islamophobia. Like folks yesterday before me, Dalia and Hatim Bazian, mentioned that is also provide a good space for the enemy within the society. Most of Eurocentrism thinking is I define myself in relation to the other, rather than defining myself and who I am. So this is not a new phenomenon, but white America, in particular conservative America, is being cornered within that thinking. So there's a need for Muslim, therefore Islamophobia work in that sense. So militarism and attack on Muslims' land, it provides a very good background for the extension of racialization. And the third piece is economic logic that governs both phenomena. So neoliberalism is a very interesting way to look at the phenomena of Islamophobia itself, because this idea of the logic of scarcity and austerity play a role in the way in which how we dehumanize the newcomer into our society. In the context of the US, most likely will be the Muslims, the black, the brown, the one doesn't fit our notion of who should be migrating to our country. So before I go further, I just would like to delve on another work that I've been doing in conjunction to Islamophobia, which is forced migration. For me, forced migration is an extension and providing also space for Islamophobes to operate within. So the responsibility of a state, a powerful country like the United States, continue to inject, to provide the space and tools for forced migration. If we think about the way in which the internal dynamics of neoliberalism, of forced migration, we find that it's situated at the heart of neoliberalism. But when these people being expelled or injected out of their society and seeking refuge or support or other places for safety, they often face with dehumanization, criminalization, and all sorts of things that Professor Sonn just talked about, some of them. And this will take me to the next point, which is the current climate, political climate in the United States. It's not an exaggeration that when we say we are really in dangerous times. I'm thinking as a global citizen. The rise of demagogue, populist, and ethno-nationalist around the world is not an easy matter that we should take lightly. I wasn't alive in the 1930s, but reading the literature, it seems to me we have kind of the same kind of climate that could really go out of hand. I'm not using scare tactic, but rather as a students of history, try to learn what the mistake that we might, not to think through it. And that will give us a glimpse of how to combat such climate. So Donald Trump's not the fairest person who engaged in Islamophobia or dehumanize Muslims, but the way in which he does it, it makes a whole difference. Because he does it before he targeted Muslim, he targeted other groups too. And as Muslim, a US Muslim, that I always think about, like, what about my other brother and sister in the American society who've been dehumanized, been excluded, been really targeted viciously by this man. But Donald Trump doesn't just speak of his mind or tweet his mind. There's a larger context of which yesterday Dalia insisted to ask the question for all of us. It is a wide power, or in my own thinking, I think about it as ethno-nationalism, because we see that in non-white society, more in India, detached in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, so and the list goes on and on. But it's the same ideology that we are the chosen people that against the rest. So it would be a great mistake if we just thought about Donald Trump, because again, the thing is about the structures. So the re-emergence of white nationalism is situated within this context of forced migration and the devastation that caused by neoliberalism. So without understanding those two things, on top of that, the structural racism, I think we will miss the point, and we will miss the way in which we could actually fight it. So, as I promised, so my work is a little bit kind of empirical data, looking at what it was and how it looks like. So, so September 11 attacks mark a new chapter in the U.S. immigration enforcement, framing immigration as a national security issue. As a result, 15 federal programs and initiatives were implemented that targeted and discriminate against Muslim individuals and communities. These measures rely on a narrative that depict Muslims as untrustworthy and in conflict with American values. This framing has justified the surveillance, racial profiling, and violation of citizens' rights and protection enshrined in the U.S. constitutions. But it also is worth noting that the federal policy and programs that discriminate against Muslims and those perceived to be Muslims, indeed it stands more than one president, since George W. Bush and including President Obama. So it again is a matter of a structural system. So this is a map that updated very recent to include all the bills that are introduced in the state legislation throughout the United States in the 50 states. So just imagine that from 2010, there's about 223 bills that introduced in the 50 states, not in the 50 states, in 43 states. And out of this 223, 20 of them enacted into law in 11 states. So it is a very serious matter. It's not just a travel ban, because the travel ban actually based on this. So there has to be something else before Mr. Trump comes with his vicious attacks against Muslims. So in our database, I will show in a little bit that The reason why we created this, we wanted to make sure that when we try to combat the phenomena, that we need actually to know what is it and how actually we could fight it. Because one of those laws, the law number 21, being struck down in the most conservative state by a single plaintiff, a Muslim woman, is in Oklahoma. So there is possibility actually to utilize the framework of the legal system that in our hand, in most cases, not in all cases, to combat Islamophobia. So this is our database. When we looked into other databases that exist to scrutinize all anti-Sharia bills, it was very hard to figure out what actual the number is and who's the player and who's the group, where the support comes from, and who those are the lawmakers actually supporting more than one bill. So when we discovered that, this will provide us as a methodology for really to understand if we want to challenge the phenomena and we want to redirect our energy for public policy advocacy, we actually know exactly where to go with that. And I really invite you to look into it, because beyond just the numbers, they have extreme details about the discriminatory effects based on American legal system and how we can challenge those. And this is another kind of infographics about why this goes back to the idea of structural racialization and why some of the anxiety or the idea that Sharia creeping into the American legal system or American life kind of push some lawmakers to sponsor not only one or two or three, but 8 bills at one legislative body. So there is more than 381 lawmakers that sponsor those 223. And most of the lawmakers who sponsor more than one are, not by far, all of them are Republicans. So that's, thank you. That will tell us a way in which to think about our political work. But that doesn't mean to absolve the Democrats, which they indeed also supported some of those legislations. So this takes me to the question, what were the consequences of anti-Sharia legislation? So I'm not going to go into a detailed suggestion, but one of the first and most important piece of that is those legislation, it really goes against the legal rights that are afforded by the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution for Muslim Americans. The laws are unnecessary to prevent Sharia from being invoked in the U.S. courts by preventing state judges from considering foreign laws in their rulings. I'm not quite sure if most of you know that, but if, let's say, I'm married to a Muslim woman in Yemen, and I have my marriage based on Islam, and my wife that has a mahr that she will get it if we divorce. If I live in, let's say, Mississippi, she actually cannot, if you divorce her, she cannot get that money. So that's one of the ways that the hypocrisy of the people who support anti-Sharia laws, one of the way in which they base their argument is to help Muslim women to be free from the oppression of Muslim men. But in reality, they devastate women's rights in the most essential piece of it. And that's one of the ways in which Muslim women, as a plaintiff, work to strike down the laws in Oklahoma based on this idea that she has a right as a divorcee to access her mahr, her dowry, and that's was against her rights as American citizen. But now, if you live again in Mississippi or one of those 11 states, the U.S. judge cannot actually ask for an opinion from a Muslim scholar about the reasoning behind any of the theology or the reasoning for anything, because the anti-Sharia bill will prohibit the judge from invoking that rights. So that's in a way devastate a Muslim to go into a personal contract. And there is other piece of how many human rights advocates and civil rights organizations see that anti-Sharia bills are intolerant of those who practice the Muslim faith. So the discriminatory effects of these bills and their affiliate campaign were identified as instigating an unfounded and non-viable fear of Sharia law. I mean, I'm very careful using Sharia and law in the same sentence, but that's how they use it. But the whole idea that is, as we understand, that no laws override the U.S. Constitution in the context of the United States. So the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law. So any other law will be supplement to the U.S. Laws in the U.S. courts. But the danger of this not only will be discriminated against Muslims, but in the future could be used against Muslims as well. Because it's the same thing, because it prohibits the use of foreign law, not necessarily just Islam. And sometimes they don't mention Sharia in particular, but they mention foreign laws. 2 minutes. Okay. I have to walk through this quickly. Many speakers mentioned this, so I can skip how the hate groups like in the United States in recent years reached 1,100 groups by end of 2018. The Muslim ban. I think there is enough talk about it, so I will skip that as well. Because I'm interested in more in policy, I would like to think with all of us about how we could use the inside-outside strategy. So for me, the work has to be espoused local, which is local, national, global. In order to do that, we have to think in two terms. One, as activists in the ground and community, but also as the people who could shape public policy. And we can do that, at least in the context of the US. I'm not quite sure about the context of other places, particularly Europe. But for me, one of the things I've been adamant advocate for, we need to really treat documentation of Islamophobia extremely serious. We don't take it lightly, and we investigate it to the full extent of it. So we cannot result to the feeling that I feel they hate me because I'm Muslim. I'm not quite sure. They hate me in the United States because I'm black first. So we need to figure out exactly what is it that's actually impacting us. And when we do that, and when we treat it as a serious field of study, like any other field of study, we will be capable of figuring out the way of dismantling it. But that goes also, it doesn't have to happen in ivory towers. It has to happen in our communities. So that's the reason why the work in the community is so essential and important for combating Islamophobia, to uplift the way in which our community feels. So one of the ways I always thought about it is we need to advocate for the Muslim community as not a monolithic community. We are so diverse, we speak different languages, we have different culture and heritage, skin tone and alike. So to develop that, we reclaiming our own narrative. And when we reclaim our own narrative, we create that, as maybe Dr. Tamara mentioned, is to create the bridge toward other people that most likely are not interested or they are inhabited by fear. So doing that from rather instead of feeling proud about yourself, about the self, is really very powerful. I live in California, so I'm very privileged within the United States in the Bay Area. So the space is very extremely allow us, not because we are native Muslims, because of the struggle of the people of California before us, especially Black, Latinos, Asian, particularly Japanese, American, who provided us a space for really hold into our civil rights and civil liberties. So in closing, there's two ways we can think about it. So one of the ways I do it, looking at legislation, for example, and the second piece, serious documentation of what Islamophobia is. And we're looking at every singular field from public health to education to media, and to document the studies that have been done in order to understand the vacuums, so we could direct the scholar. Maybe you don't need to write about discourse in Orientalism. Maybe we need somebody to look at education, because that's where the field is missing the idea. And the third and the last one, for example, like in your right, is we are using the international human rights mechanism to confront the U.S. federal government in international arena. So we write in the CIRD, which is the Committee for Elimination of All Forms of Ethnic Discrimination, and the other one is an International Covenant in Civil and Political Rights, which could be used. So every 5 years we write a shadow report and devastated State Department's report about the protection of civil liberties. And trust me, sometimes we win. So there is tools. I also understand that some people say, but the whole empire of evil need to be brought down to its knees. But I think our communities and our people doesn't have the luxury of time till we bring down the empire. So we need to think about twice. Let's work short term and long term. Till the empires come down, let's do the other work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's fine. I would like to ask you first a question. It relates again to something that you as well said in the beginning, when you had those three aspects of Islamophobia on the slide, and you were talking about the economic aspect of Islamophobia. Now, yesterday there was a comment on, especially relating to Muslims in Europe being mostly in low-income jobs, and I'm just wondering, what would you suggest? How do we bridge this sort of contradiction in the attitude, or how do we navigate the challenges where basically, when we're talking about, well, let's say Muslim immigration, right? And you were saying that there are these discourses on who should we take in, right? And oftentimes, at least in Europe, it's about, we should take labor force. But what do we mean by labor force? Because if Muslims, if they end up in so-called low-income jobs, then the argument is they're taking away our jobs. But if they are highly educated and then they end up in high-income jobs, then it's about, they're going to take over the world. And this is also something they don't want, because obviously it has to do with social capital, financial capital, and, it's a basically elite position. So what is your comment on this contradiction? Thank you. Huh? Oh yeah, okay, so let's do it like this. If you just can take note of my question, and then we will have all the questions together at the end. Okay, great. Now, do we have questions from the audience for Mr. Elsadig? You don't want? All right, well, then we will do it that way. Okay, now, the next speaker is Dr. Asim Qureshi, and he graduated in law with a PhD in international conflict analysis, and he is the research director at the advocacy group CAGE. And he has written here. So since 2003, he has specialized in investigating the impact of counterterrorism practices worldwide. He has published a wide range of NGO reports, academic journals, and articles. In 2009, he authored the book Rules of the Game, Detention, Deportation, Disappearance, and in 2018, the book A Virtue of Disobedience. Since 2010, he has been advising legal teams in the US and at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Now, he's going to give us a speech that focuses on the intersections between racism and Islamophobia as forms of structural violence. Would you like to go to the podium? Yes, please.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you to CIGA and Izu. It's a real privilege to be here. Also, in particular, I'm going to start off by just saying one quick word about victims, right? We have many so-called victims of the war on terror that really refer to them as survivors. People have gone through very, very difficult things. And these people are my heroes, these people who survive what they go through. They're the most remarkable people on the planet. They suffer the hard end of counterterrorism policy and structural racism every single day. And then we have our superheroes. And I really want to acknowledge Dr. Samuel Arian and my khala, Auntie Nahla here. Because really, doing this work for the last 16 years, you see people who want to defend their rights, they want to defend themselves, they have a very, very difficult time. But when you see not just a person who's being affected, but their family refusing to compromise when they know an issue like Palestine will be impacted by the decisions that they make, these are my superheroes. These are the people that I teach my children to admire and respect above all others. The ones who are willing to take the hits for the sake of us all. So for me, to be even on this platform in front of people I consider to be the most honorable parts of our community is such an honor. So that's what I say to them. And I pray that Allah SWT protects them and their families, always, inshallah. So I'm going to start off with another quick word about the word pathology. We've heard a lot of the speakers use the word pathology and pathologize throughout the last 3 days. And I just want to give a quick explanation for those who perhaps weren't aware why this word was being used so often. I mean, pathology is a word that comes from the medical side of things, right? We use the word in order to help us identify diseases in the body, all right? So why are we talking about it in relation to Islamophobia? So I hope to clarify that as I go along with my talk, but I just wanted to identify what the word means in its essence. Okay, it's about identifying things that have to do with our physiology, right? I'm sure you can already think about why that makes sense in the context of Islamophobia and racism. But where do I want to start, right? I want to start with a kind of niche, kind of area that I'm somewhat of a little connoisseur of, which is early 90s gangster rap music from the West Coast, all right? So, bear with me. It will make sense, inshallah. Why am I talking about this? Because in the early 90s, what you had were certain groups and rap artists emerging who were talking and rapping about issues that they saw going on in their streets, right? So NWA, a little bit earlier in the 90s, had the song F the Police. You had a whole range of songs by Tupac that mentioned killing of police officers. You had Ice-T's very famous song Cop Killer. And of course these songs became extremely popular. But what happened is that the chief of police for New York, he wrote a very long editorial because at the same time there was a spike in the number of police officers that were being shot. Not just in New York, but around the country. And he said that this music creates violence. right? That's what he says, especially amongst black people. That we need to stop, we need to ban this music because this music creates violence. And there was a very famous legal case where the wife of a police officer who was killed by a man who was listening to a Tupac song when it happened, took Time Warner and Tupac to court in order to say that this song had led to her husband, a police officer's. I think the court threw out in the First Amendment and said this is a freedom of speech issue, right? But the main thing is that what was it about this argument that was so problematic, right? Because the music is violent. Now, I don't think any of us can deny that. But why was the argument problematic? The argument was problematic because, as one sociologist came along and said, why aren't white people listening to this music killing anybody, right? Like, it was such a simple question, right? And it defeated the whole argument that the chief of police was making. Because surely, if the music creates the violence, right, then that means that it shouldn't just be white people, that black people who are committing that violence. It should be white people as well. But it wasn't. Because when it comes to violence, there are so many other factors that take place. Nobody was talking about social deprivation, police brutality, structural racism, all of these things, right, that go into producing the culture that sits around why violence takes place in the first place. So what were they doing here, the police, when they were talking about this, and prosecutors and lawyers that were trying to really crack down on this type of music? They were trying to pathologize blackness. They were trying to pathologize black people and the way in which not only they look, but the way they behave, their ideas, their beliefs, even their creativity, okay, to describe the world that they live in. Because when we think about the pathologization of racism, we're not just looking at skin color. It's not just to do with our melanin, okay? It's to do with all of the cultural cues that are used in order to identify us as threats, because it's in the body and it's in our minds and it's in our culture that we become threats to white power, to ethno-nationalism, as Elsadig mentioned. So I want us to think about, as this talk goes on, the architecture of racism, not just the simple manifestations of it, right? This isn't just about street violence. It's not just about being attacked in the street by a far-right guy. It's not just about New Zealand and being killed in a mosque, right? When we're talking about the architecture of racism, or structural racism, as we prefer to refer to it, it's about the media, it's about politicians, it's about the military, it's about the police, it's about prosecutors, it's about judges, juries, doctors, teachers, university lecturers, and the person on the street, finally. But it's a filtration process. It doesn't start at the bottom, right? The person on the street is the final manifestation of everything that came before. So when we talk about the root causes of any issue, we're talking about where does it begin? And it begins with power and the way that then power deploys that architecture to act violently in racist ways against different communities. So now let's talk about Islamophobia, right? Because of course there are critiques of Islamophobia. People say, how can you be fearful of a religion? Religion should be open to critique. And I know there's a lot of people in here who will take kind of umbrage with the word and the use of the word Islamophobia, preferring anti-Muslim racism, anti-Muslim violence. There are many other formulations, okay, for how people want to describe this phenomenon. To be fair, I don't really care about that. Like, I genuinely don't. You can call it what you like. What I want, though, okay, is for us to agree on what the architecture is. So whatever we call it, when we say that word, we all know what we mean when we say it. Okay, that's what needs to be agreed on. Not the word itself. The word is meaningless, right? We give power to that word, whatever we choose. Okay, but what we have to agree on is that when we're all talking about something, it should mean the same, right? So what is about Islamophobia, and why am I talking about it in terms of racism? because it replicates the logic of racism completely. There is a focus on pathologizing of our identities, of our beliefs, of our behaviors. So, for example, when we talk about a white person who is a non-Muslim on day 1, on day 2 they convert to Islam, and perhaps now start to exhibit Muslim registers of Muslimness, hijab, lihya, clothes, so on and so forth, they have now transformed into a racialized body. They are now pathologized not because of their melanin anymore, they are pathologized because of the superficial registers that we provide, okay, to white power, to ethno-nationalism, so they can identify us and therefore react to us in a way that is racist, that is structurally racist, right? So, talking about more my field, which is terrorism, counterterrorism, if you take the UK's Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, we have 50,000 British citizens, okay, because non-citizens aren't detained under this act, it's only citizens. 50,000 citizens each year detained at ports, okay? Why? There is no suspicion required. It's purely a profiling exercise, okay, purely a profiling exercise. So what are they using when they profile you that way? Because they always say the same thing. There's no intelligence-led stop here. Okay, it's just a profile. So 50,000 people a year, okay, and the vast majority of whom are Muslim. They're using superficial registers. They're using your name. They're using the way you look. They're using any other symbol of Muslimness that gives away to the border agent that you are somebody who has entered into a matrix of threat that they then use in order to stop you. That's pathology, because the disease for them is inside those superficial registers, right? They have to connect it to the body somehow, okay? Whether it's through the name or whatever. We're still using the name as a superficial aspect of who we are. You could be a non-Muslim with the name Ahmed Sheikh, right? Like you could easily, right? We know plenty of Muslims or non-Muslims with Arabic names, okay? But it's still a marker of what? Of Muslimness. And it's interesting that you find Coptic Christians with Muslim names who talk about their experiences of being stopped at airports. And similarly, in America, you have no-fly lists, right? No-fly lists are used extensively. We're talking about tens of thousands of Muslims, even young children on these lists. Why? Because of, again, the superficial. Sorry, I know I keep on using that word, but it's important. So, why is this important? Because racism is violence. It is a violent act that takes place against us, and it is a violent act that has meaning for us in our lives. It creates trauma that sometimes has very, very long-term consequences, including intergenerational consequences. I'm going to give you a few, because I prefer always to talk about my clients rather than in the abstract, because like Elsadig, I'm an activist scholar rather than a scholar activist, right? You know, I start off in the field and I produce my academia from the field. So I'm going to talk to you about a friend of mine, Dr. Rizwan Sabir, who was detained for 7 days in pre-charge detention in the UK. He was released after 7 days, but the law allows him to be held for 7 days. Why was he stopped? He was stopped because he downloaded the Al-Qaeda training manual as part of his PhD looking into terrorism, right? Now, a very reasonable question is, would that have happened to a white academic? And the simple answer is no. And why no? Because we actually know that no white academic has yet to be detained in the last 18 years of the war on terror for downloading a terrorism publication. We're still waiting for that to happen. Of course it doesn't happen. Why? Because they're not pathologized for reading that material. They're not at risk. And Rizwan will tell you himself that actually he was reading this stuff because in his mind he wanted to help the government stop terrorism, right? Alhamdulillah, he's one of our radical academics now, okay, who's doing brilliant work, okay, critiquing racism and structural racism. So, in a small way, thanks to the UK government for giving us him. But there are other cases as well. like a very young man, Rahman Mohammadi, a 16-year-old boy, who was pulled up by counter-terrorism police in his house. Why? Because Rahman, wow, really, 5 minutes already? Because he was wearing a Palestine badge to school. Okay, so they pathologized him, again, based on what? Interesting enough, when they finally turned up at his house, and they started asking him questions, they asked him what sect of Islam he was, and he said Shia, and they said, oh, well, actually, we're not interested in that particular sect, right? Then, of course, you have my 7-year-old client. I'll just call him Ahmed. Ahmed was pulled out of his class by counter-terrorism police and questioned about his views on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Okay, again, nothing to do with anything other than the fact that they used Palestine as a register for problematizing you. And again, going back to being stopped at the airport, one of the most common questions that Muslims find when they get stopped at the airport is, what is your view on the Israel-Palestine conflict? Okay, constantly being presented within a threat matrix because of what we believe in politically as well as religiously. Finally, I'm going to give you the example of Rukhsana Begum. Rukhsana Begum, in the UK, it's illegal to possess a terrorism publication. So the burden of proof is reversed. Usually you are innocent until proven guilty. With a terrorism publication, you're guilty unless you can prove that you are innocent. Okay, so they reverse the burden of proof. So when you go to court, you have to prove the alternative, right? So in her case, her lawyer told her, look, no jury's going to find you sympathetic, so I urge you to plead guilty. So she pleads guilty in order to get a reduced sentence, and the judge says in her sentencing statement, you are a good citizen, I believe that you had this document for reasonable reasons or whatever, that you had no terrorist intention, that you had no terrorist purpose, but I'm still going to give you a 12-month sentence in order to force you through mandatory de-radicalization. He's already acknowledged that she doesn't have any terrorist intent and that, you know, she had her whole life ahead of her. He even said that, you know, you are a brilliant student, right? But he still gives her a 12-month sentence in order to, what? In order to force her through mandatory de-radicalization, right? I wrote a whole journal, an academic journal piece on her case that I can share a link to later. So racism is violence, right? As I said already. The trauma that comes is physiological. So many of my clients, for example, who have been through detentions or even these interactions, small interactions with security agents or being pulled out of the classroom, right? They talk about the intense paranoia they feel all the time. I have multiple clients who they've never been placed in jail, but they were just arrested or they were just stopped by the police. They talk about how their hyperarousal system has now been changed indefinitely. So they're constantly worried about where the next threat is coming from, even suspecting their friends and their family. So what does this do? This causes tension and trauma within the community where we can't even trust ourselves anymore. We can't trust one another. So what am I saying? And I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to try and wrap up as soon as possible. My call is this, that we as communities cannot afford to engage with the systems of racism and Islamophobia. When they say to you, work within the system, and a system like, for example, CBE, which is based on a racist logic, right? We don't have the time and the space and the life to engage in that system of racism. We have to say, no, that's racist, and I would be racist for engaging in it. We would all like to think up well of ourselves. We would all like to think that if we lived in apartheid, we'd be anti-apartheid activists. If we lived in the Black Civil Rights Movement, we'd be anti-Jim Crow, anti any kind of racist structure that existed previously. But why is it when it comes to the war on terror, we have Muslims who say we need to engage with CBE? No, you should be considered collaborators only. Okay? And that is the view that we have to take, because it's not good enough that we just call out Brandon Tarrant, okay, the guy who did the New Christchurch shooting. He's a low-hanging fruit. He is a manifestation of everything that came before him. I even think he's probably psychologically unwell. My work is to deal with extremely violent offenders and who committed violent crimes. Nearly always they have some trauma history, mental health history, right? I'm assuming this guy probably does too. But I'm more interested in what produced Brandon Tarrant, not in Brandon Tarrant himself. He's meaningless to me in the sense that I want to know what produced him, because that production system is really my real enemy. So can we be Islamophobic and Muslim? Okay. Yes, I want to say we can. We can be Muslims and Islamophobic at the same time if we engage in systems of racism. There's a very famous book that got published a couple of years ago called Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr. And he shows that 20% of black people, black police officers in Chicago, have a view towards black people that is indistinguishable from the Ku Klux Klan. That is how racist these black officers have become. He talks about judges, black judges, giving higher sentences to black defendants, okay, because of the internalization of these systems of racism, these structures of racism. And of course in the UK we have Sajid Javed, who is a non-Muslim, but is constantly, his Muslimness is deployed in order to harm us when they want to bring in new policy to kind of put pressure on the Muslim community, right? So representation itself is not a panacea. I would much rather be represented by a non-Muslim who's ethical than talk about having a Muslim who reached the highest echelon of power and harmed me within the system of racism. So a final or maybe more tadabburi point, because most of us here are Muslim. Thinking about the Quran in our own tradition. In my book last year, Virtue Disobedience, I wrote about this. That really, when we're thinking about racism, you have to think about the very first sin that we're told about in the Quran, which has nothing to do with Adam alayhi, well, it does with Adam alayhi salam in particular, but it's Iblis. He was a Muslim. He knew, he saw everything, he saw the heavens, he saw Allah, creation, everything. And he said, what? I am better than him. I am made of fire, and he is made of clay. If there was ever a moment anywhere in our texts that taught us that racism is an evil that we must combat, it is surely this most fundamental point that it comes right from the very first moment of our creation. That focusing on the superficial, focusing on betterness because of superficial manifestations is something that is of the worst of sins. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Many thanks, Dr. Elsheikh. The last speaker of our panel is Dr. Talip Kucukcan. He's a senior fellow at the TRT World Research Center and a professor of sociology at the Marmara University in Istanbul. He was a member of the Turkish Parliament and the head of Turkish delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe between 2015 and 18. Dr. Kucukcan was the director of foreign policy research at the Foundation for Political, Economic and Social Research, and he was also the representative of the OSCE chairperson in office on combating intolerance and discrimination against Muslims for 2014 and 2015. He is specialized in foreign relations with a focus on Middle Eastern affairs, Turkey-EU relations, and migration. Now, Dr. Kucukcan is going to give us a speech entitled The Secularization of Islam and Muslims After 9/11, Reasons and Consequences. And in this speech, he's firstly going to examine the secularization of Islam and Muslims, as well as afterwards look at the reasons and mechanisms behind that. And finally, he will also look at how this process influences the daily life of Muslims, minorities. The floor is yours, Dr. Kucukcan.
Thank you, Linda. I join my friends to thank CIGA, its administration, Professor Sami, and also all those people who put their efforts in organization of this conference, actually. And also I would like to thank people who have spoken before me, because I learned quite a lot from them. Probably I will repeat some of the things that they have said. because it is unfair to expect from the last speaker to say anything and everything original. I am the last speaker. Actually, the organizers placed me rightly, literally. I'm the last person who will speak about this topic because everybody here in this, among the audience as well as in the podium, given their expertise both coming from the policy-oriented people and also from the academia. And I have read some of the books written by the speakers, and Norton, for example. I have read her excellent book on the Muslims in Europe. Now I'll be talking about several issues, but I don't think I can cover all the things that Linda has said in her introduction. One is the concept, actually. I disagree a little bit from Dr. Amin because he said he doesn't care about the words. I care about the words and concepts, actually, because we articulate through concepts. We convey our messages through concepts and words, and we have listened to all the nice papers, excellent papers, with words, a language. But of course, I also agree with him, on the other hand, that we should agree on what it is. In my view, Islamophobia as it is, as we understand today, does not really reflect the gravity of the problems that we mean when we talk about Islamophobia. It is, in my view, a hostility, it's a hatred, it's a racism, it's an anti-Muslim attitude, behavior, etc. So we need to underline that fact because Islamophobia is a soft, I think, concept. It does not really tell us what it is. Anti-Semitism is much strong, for example, and it makes a sense when you talk about anti-Semitism. And also, some of the concepts, some of the words actually provide a ground on which you can not only build a discourse, but also take some legal actions and legal, maybe establish legal structures. When you say Islamophobia, what kind of legal instruments you can introduce? But when you say anti-Semitism, and there is a definition of anti-Semitism, and I think some legal steps were taken. Now, I argue that Islamophobia is a social, cultural, and political construction. I mean hatred against Muslims, or anti-Muslim racism, I would say. And at the root of it, there is an essentialization of Islam and Muslims throughout history, and also emergence of monolithic perceptions and attitudes. As our good friend said, in the American context, there is a huge diversity within the Muslim community, and it is the same in the UK as well. However, when you look at the mainstream representation or the dominant representation of Islam in the media, in the academia, in the political discourse, you will see that more or less there is the same monolithic perception of Muslims. And in the opening session on Friday afternoon, I think most of the things were said there. That is the presence of Muslims in the world stage. How this Islamophobia, hatred against Muslims, or essentializations or monolithic perceptions emerged. I think that has something to do with the entrance of Islam into the world politics, world stage. It's been referred before us that Islam has its own ontologies or epistemology, and it's a different worldview than the one that dominated the world before Islam came. Therefore, I would like to mention a number of areas where we can find maybe some of the roots, some of the, let's say, foundations of Islamophobia. I would call them encounters between Islam and Muslims, and I will talk about 7 stages of that encounter, which will help us to explain what we have today, because Islamophobia is not a new phenomenon. It's very old, but what we see may be different manifestations of today, and also maybe more and more visible victimhood of Muslims. The first encounter is Muslims' presence in Spain, in my mind. The Muslims entered Europe because Islamophobia is mostly a Eurocentric perception, and the Western, let's say, creation, as we have seen in the works of Elsadig, etc., in Orientalism. It is usually a concept, it's a discourse that has emerged in the West but spread all around the world. Not only the discourse, but also anything related to that. There's a behavioral, I think, aspect of it. There's a political aspect of it, which we will come later on maybe. Therefore, Islam came to Spain or to Europe, and I think in my mind many things started there. The second most important encounter is the Crusades. It's been referred also here in this podium that those, I think, historical relations has created some of the early images like barbarism, the wars, the Muslims being savages, etc., etc. And of course, what we see here, Crusaders, there's a religious. This is a religious encounter actually. Maybe there's a political flavor in it, but if you look at the justification of Crusaders, we will see that religion is there, and it was Christianity vis-a-vis, I think, Islam. And the third encounter is, again, between Muslims and Europeans, or the Westerners, through Ottoman conquest of many places in Europe. You can imagine that Ottoman Empire has conquered or invaded many places in Europe, and it has gone up to the doors of Vienna. I think that created some images about Muslims and also Islam in the past. And a number of, I think, references were made in the earlier that in the Balkans there were Muslim people, and the guy who killed more than 50 people in New Zealand, he made references to the Ottomans and Serbians in the past. You can see that whatever we talk about today, it has a very deep, I think, historical background. So sometimes references, sometimes legitimacy is drawn from that period. I think fourth important encounter in my mind that left a huge legacy is colonialism. Colonialism, I think everybody talked about here, what kind of legacy it has left. Colonialism in the Middle East, in North Africa, in South Asia, and the images that were created or transported from the colonized societies to the colonizers. And what we have seen there, the establishment of this hegemonic worldview, and also the hegemonic discourse, actually, that is still, I think, there. Maybe colonialism literally ended, but when you look at the other aspects of colonialism, whether it's intellectual colonialism or psychological victimhood, I think it is still there. And when we have this north-south distinction, I think there's also that background in the minds of people, because colonized societies or the countries, they were less developed, they were not progressive, etc., etc. Therefore, the colonizers had that duty of educating the colonized world. I think that image is still there, and when you look at the international relations especially, you will find some of the images popping up there. The fifth encounter is the migration in the 1950s and 1960s. People talk about migration, especially migration towards the West, and also migration to the United States, but there is a difference between the immigrant communities between the States and Europe. From Maghreb, from South Asia, from India, Pakistan, from Turkey, thousands of people migrate to European countries, and of course they carried their religion, cultures, ethnicity, even the culinary culture, music, as you have said. I think these developments played an important role in the construction of the image of Muslims and Islam in the minds of many people. Eurocentric, I think, discourse is very much using this concept. Still, but I'll come to that later on, the idea of populism and how it is spreading out, how it is legitimized, is also rooted in some of those experiences that I have just said. And if you look at those countries, if you look at France, Germany, Britain, where you have a significant number of Muslim minorities, though they are citizens, but still called minorities somehow. The image is that if you talk to people on the ground, in the street, they think that there's much more than the Muslims in their own country. For example, if you, as you said, the person the ordinary person is the last one. But when you ask people, any ordinary French, for example, how many Muslims are present in the country, they would always exaggerate the numbers. Not because they know it, but because of the discourse coming from the media, from the academia, from the politicians. So we will talk about that later on, probably. And the sixth, I think, encounter, which was also mentioned here, I think that was one of the maybe turning points in modern times, is the 9/11 attacks that happened in the United States of America. Because that opened a new chapter in terms of liberal interventionism, for example. Iraq was invaded, Afghanistan, as everybody knows, and other kinds of interventions that took place. So you can see that 9/11 attacks were a turning point in terms of securitization, in terms of opening new chapters by way of liberal intervention, etc. But it was not only 9/11. We have seen similar attacks, maybe in a different way. Victims were again mostly Europeans, but not at the same scale. In London, for example, there was an attack in June. It was 7/7 of London, and also in Spain there were some attacks on the trains. So these were all, I think, issues that were emphasized and worked by many people. And the seventh encounter, which is fairly new, is the rise of ISIS. I think that has also very much encouraged many people and also motivated many governments to essentialize and also to securitize Islam and Muslims, because ISIS is seen or associated with Muslims. Although Muslims in the world, they always said ISIS has nothing to do with Islam or Muslims, but since Muslims cannot produce, let's say, very powerful discourse because of the lack of media, because of the lack of maybe cooperation among Muslim countries, or because of the lack of legitimacy in many Muslim countries, or many of the conflicting issues, what we have seen that in the last couple of years, the ISIS and or the ISIS was associated with Islam and Muslims, regardless of the views of the Muslims, actually. And also the attacks in Paris and the Belgium later on, we have always, I think, seen similar issues that led to the securitization of Islam. When I talk about securitization of Islam, actually, I'm not only talking about Islam as seen as a national security. It is, I think, much more that. In the opening session, I think it was also mentioned that we can talk about securitization of culture, securitization of an identity, securitization of civilization. It's not only Muslims as a threat, as a physical threat, as terrorists, but it is more than that. Therefore, I think Islam and Muslims are described or viewed as an existential threat to European or Western values and civilization. That's what I mean by essentialization or securitization, actually. And of course, the end of the Cold War is yet another maybe time that we need to look at very closely, because the end of the war, the Cold War was a bipolar war. On the one hand, you had the liberal world, democratic world led by the West. On the other hand, you had Soviet Union, a communist bloc, which was a threat to these all progressive values. When the Cold War ended, you have seen all this clash of civilizations, ideas, etc. The communism is replaced by Islam and Muslims in the popular discourse as well as in the academic discourse, which was also bought by many politicians. And I think when we talk about securitization, we also need to talk about securitization of demography. And what I mean by demography is that some of you would remember the cover page of Economist several years ago. The cover page had this concept, Eurabia. Eurabia meaning Europe is becoming a Muslim, or something like Arabia, because of the presence of Muslims in this country. Therefore, European identity was very much threatened by the presence of Muslims. Now, let me look at the consequences of this idea of securitization. Of course, it was mentioned earlier that the first and I think most important consequences was limiting the civil liberties of Muslims. Amin also has said that Europe, in the United States, we have seen this Patriot Act, U.S. Patriot Act, and also that was followed by many European Union countries, actually, they have initiated and they have introduced anti-terror laws. If you look at the details of anti-terror laws and whom they have targeted these laws, you will see that the victims were mostly Muslims actually. And we have seen profiling of Muslims on the basis of religion and surveillance of mosques actually, which were never taking place especially in Europe. We have seen, for example, from Turkey, we were following it because there are many Turkish communities and Turkish mosques. In Denmark, in Germany, for the first time, German police and Danish police went into the mosques actually, they did some searches. Therefore, this is an important, I think, step that was taken, limiting the civil liberties. The second area, that's a strong word, but I will use it, cleansing of Islam from the public sphere. Because public sphere is defined as a very secular space in the minds of Europe, in the minds of Americans. Therefore, any public appearance of Islam was troubling. Headscarf, demanding for halal food, etc. These were things as normal. I did my master's and PhD in UK in the 1990s, mid-1990s. When you demand those things, for example, it was okay. UK is different than maybe many other countries, but we have seen that in France and in other countries, the regulations with regard to hijab and other things started to come. Therefore, the character of the public sphere has changed. The secularity was much more emphasized in those places. The third consequence was, again, it is in contradiction with the, I think, European and Western tradition, the state intervention in religion. In those countries, in many countries in Europe, the state does not intervene in religion, and they don't try to create a state-sponsored religion. But what we have seen in Germany and in France at least, these are two good examples that we can say, the governments attempted to nationalize or tame Islam and Muslims in the name of okay, 2 minutes. You are taming me as well. Thank you very much. In France, we have seen, yes, in France, we have seen the creation of attempt to create a French Islam. Islamic Council of France was created by the state actually. Similarly, in Germany, the German Islam Conference was created by the German Minister of Interior. And there are some Muslims who are accepted in those organizations, and there are some Muslims who are not, actually. And the fifth consequence is the victims, the violence, actually, that you have elaborated on that. With that note, I will finish here. Thank you.
Wonderful, many thanks, Dr. Talip. Now we will continue with questions from the audience, and I will take maximum 3 questions from the audience, and each person has 1 minute over there. The first question with, oh my God, I forgot your name.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. Thank you from our distinguished guests for their enlightenment. I have one question from Dr. Asim, and I was very happy when you raised sort of, I call it the Islamophobic Muslims, because like from my personal experience in the countries of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan, those mainly the majority are Muslims, but I personally experienced the Islamophobia over here. What I mean by that is they're all born Muslims, I mean by birth, but they have Islamophobic ideology, at least in a sense. So how do you put a consensus, I mean, how do you give as a solution? What's your consideration on that? And I just want to thank from Dr. Talip when he talked about the public sphere for secular in Europe. It was really fantastic. Thank you.
Over there. Oh, okay. And the next, Ahmed.
So my question is for Mr. Talib is, you've mentioned the reasons, like 8 or 9 reasons, but can you, it's a question from me and my friend, can you just clarify or divide the reasons into the reasons of Islamophobia in a society or a government and the reasons of Islamophobia in the social life between people. Can you just clarify these points, please?
The third question here in the middle, the gentleman with the green jacket.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is for Dr. Asim as well. Dr. Asim, you have already mentioned the causes and consequences of racism that takes place, especially in the UK, and how the UK government is taking profiles of 50,000 citizens a year. So my question is regarding this point is what's the role that the Muslim community in the UK, and are they taking any steps toward mitigating these the hard time that the UK government are implementing on them? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. We have, after the lunch, actually another panel where we can still ask questions to the speakers, so we might do that, okay? I'm just restricting the questions now so that we can go and eat. So the speakers have each 3 minutes to answer the questions so far. Thank you so much.
Shall I start? Okay, there was one question addressed to me, that is whether we can classify Islamophobia on the political level and on the social level. Yeah, of course, I mean, there are different levels of Islamophobia, but when we look at the production, let's say, and the construction of that term, that mentality, that attitude, it is not the society itself, actually. The society is the users. They are not the manufacturers. If you look at the sites of Islamophobia, you will see that the first site is the positive discourse, education, the books, the materials, history, the media. People actually learn from those sources. Therefore, I'm not trying to say that the society is innocent, but I think when you look at this kind of hierarchical production and manufacturing of this industry, let's say, it is the government, it is the politicians, it is the media, but the society is just at the bottom end of that. Thank you. And as far as the question was to you, the Islamophobes within the Muslim community, within Islam, don't go anywhere else. If you look at Turkey and what happened in Turkey in the last 30, 40 years, you will see that there are lots of Islamophobes within Muslims.
Afwan, if you don't mind, I'm going to leave that question to our Sheikh over here, because I think it's clear what my views are, but I'd like to hear from other people as well, inshallah. So, profiling exercises like no-fly lists and being stopped at ports, what's the role the Muslim community can play? So it's interesting. Around 4 years ago, I was in South Africa with my colleague Muhammad Rabbani from Cage, and we were talking. We were, in our hotel, and we were just chatting to one another one night, and we were talking about how do we really bring a stop to some of this stuff. And I said, well, really, like the only time we're going to be able to do this, right, is when all of us refuse to engage with their questions. Now, that comes with a consequence, because in the UK, it's illegal to not answer their questions. Whatever question they ask you at a port, coming in or out, if you refuse to do so, you have committed a terrorism act, okay? And you are convicted as a terrorist for not doing so. If you refuse to hand over your passwords, if you refuse to hand over your devices, you have committed an act of terrorism, okay? So it comes with a serious consequence. And my point was, only at the point where they have to deal with 100 cases in court per year of Muslims who are refusing to engage in the racist policy, will they then have to rethink the policy? Because what are they going to do? They're going to convict all of us for terrorism like every week until this stops, right? But the problem is that comes at a cost. So the reason why that story is interesting is that in November 2016, I was in Doha with Rabbani again, We were working on a very high-profile torture case of a man who had been in solitary confinement in the U.S. Charleston Naval Brig for 13 years, one of the 3 enemy combat cases, and we had taken a long trauma testimony from him. I had gone to, after that, I had gone to fly off to Amman to do some further work, but Ravani came back home, and when he was stopped in the airport, the police demanded the passwords to his devices, and he said, I can't do this. I can't do this because I have client confidential information. In the end, it came down to whether or not he would give up client confidential information, or if he would, go to prison. And he chose the latter. So he took a real courageous stand and chose to protect our client's data. Now the problem is, he was eventually convicted. Alhamdulillah, he didn't serve any prison time, but he was convicted as a terrorist. Now, obviously this had a good impact on the community. The community felt very empowered by the stance that he took, but it was on his own. I think when these things happen, when civil disobedience happen, it has to happen en masse. But we're not politically savvy enough, and we love the dunya too much, let's be honest, to take those kind of hits for ourselves, right? So I think that's the problem, that until we get over this fear of the violence that the state can harm us with, we'll never proceed in terms of actually challenging the racism of these policies.
So very quick on Islamophobia within Muslim society and the economic question. I will combine both of them because, in my own opinion, is about the internal contradictions of both. Yesterday, it was a brilliant presentation about, for example, I would like not to focus in Central Asia, but I want to focus in the Gulf countries. Because in my opinion, the Gulf countries, particularly United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, engaging in very massive Islamophobic propaganda against the Muslim in the diaspora. I was talking to my friend over there about, I look at the security apparatus in the United States, so I was studying the way in which the creator of Blackwater, which is the largest global army in the world, spent Eric Prince. Eric Prince, when President Obama came to office, he went him for questioning in the US Congress. So he ran away from the United States. You know where he went? He took refuge in Abu Dhabi. And in Abu Dhabi, he engaged with Mohammed bin Zayed in creation of the largest Muslim missionary army. And the first test for that was Yemen. So we need to understand this, the contradiction. Why I'm saying contradiction in relation to economic questions. Because if the goal is power, therefore everything could be justified. If that's the goal. In terms of economics, I will do it under 3 minutes. Neoliberalism, in general, in the last 4 decades, one of the internal dynamic of it is the massive contradictions. So I want cheaper labor force in order to maximize profit. How I do that? I have to destroy the labor condition and labor contracts in the countries that provide social welfare, like West Europe and United States. So, for example, Donald Trump, he want to build massive real estate. What does he need? Cheap labor. Where they get them? From south of the border. Can he get them legally? No. He will get them illegally or undocumented. But he comes 20 years later. What he does, he uses the same framework to access power. So that the inherent contradiction, it does 2 things. One, you get the cheap labor force, which is that's what Europe and I agree with the gentleman here, saying that not only those countries developing, but they are underdeveloped by particular methodology of the central part of the empire, is that the forced migration, it generates in itself massive benefits to a certain circle of power in the West, and at the same time provide them as a vehicle to access power. So if I can get you to destroy the labor force, because the labor force in the post-advanced economy is the most like in the forefront of defending their rights, therefore defending the right of social welfare, etc., which doesn't allow the expansion of wealth inequality in the country. So you need to drive a wedge between working class, local, and the newcomers. Put them in competition, you win. You divide them. And when that becomes so hard for you to continue, you have to provide an alternative distraction, which is you scapegoating those newcomers themselves. So we as the Muslims will provide a golden opportunity, and I remind here by what happened with Yan yesterday said, we are the financial benefits to Islamophobes in many cases. So we need just to understand that. So before I close, if you look also at Sisi in Egypt, you'll find the same similarity. You know, so we in our Islamic world, we are not necessarily free from Islamophobes. So I agree with you. We should just look around us, and it's everywhere, because that has to do not colonialism, but with coloniality, which is a mindset of a colonial person who freed from colonialism but cannot free their mind.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful panel and for the wonderful presentations. Just going to end here by giving you the party awards. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the person who's been behind the scenes doing all the organizations and all the work, Yunus Akdeniz. He is the assistant director. Now it's time for lunch because we're a bit late. We're going to start the next session, which will be a final session, which is basically conversations with the speakers. And it's going to be open conversation. We're going to know more about them and their views and how to confront Islamophobia. So we'll be back to reconvene back here at 3:30. Thank you very much.